Welcome to the Naavik Gaming Podcast, where it is our mission to explore the business and future of video games. We bring together the industry's brightest builders, investors, and thinkers to keep a pulse on current events, dissect emerging trends in games, share lessons learned, and have a great time. This podcast is also part of Naavik's growing ecosystem, which ranges from free and premium research to consulting and advisory services. For more information, visit www.naavik.co. This episode is brought to you by Metal.tv, built by gamers, for gamers, and used by over 15 million gamers per month. Metal is the fastest way to clip, save, and share gameplay on PC. Millions of clips get shared every week, turning your game's moments into word of mouth at internet scale. With discovery being one of the biggest challenges in the games industry today, Metal is building a platform where publishers, studios, marketers, or anyone looking to reach gamers can find the right players across multiple genres and geographies. For more information, head to metal.tv or check out the link in the show notes. Now, let's jump into the episode.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Devin Becker, and today I'm delighted once again to be joined by Aaron Bush, managing partner and co-founder here at Naavik. And today we're going to discuss some of the more concrete ways the game industry is actually using AI currently, based off some of the things they've said publicly and some of the things we kind of have an idea are happening behind the scenes. But first things first, let's talk about what's going on at Naavik.
Yeah, well, what's up, Devin? Always happy to be on here. I mean, with Naavik, is business as usual in a lot of ways, but one thing that we're gearing up to change is expanding our content ecosystem. And so right now, we obviously have this podcast. We also have one newsletter, Naavik Digest. But one thing that we've learned over the years that we're finally going to take some action on is that even though it's one industry, the glorious games industry, different people in different parts of the industry just care about fundamentally very different things. And so we're working on expanding our content line to better serve more specific people and more specific verticals. But actually where we're kicking things off, and this will publish next week, is we're launching an AI and gaming newsletter. And the purpose of the newsletter is to just figure out what the heck is going on, learn best practices, and just help everyone stay on top of what's new in the industry. In some ways, we're writing this for ourselves because we work with all sorts of clients that have all sorts of different needs. Obviously, through our content, we're always trying to stay on top of what's happening. But really, we always just find that learning in public is a great way to stay on top of things ourselves, but also a way to kind of give back and learn with everybody else. And so this AI and gaming newsletter will be very exciting. More to come soon. If you just follow along with Naavik Digest right now, you'll be able to see when we get started on that. But otherwise, just excited to be here today. And also, I'm not the game maker at the company, and so a little bit of me feels a little bit of imposter syndrome being here talking about AI and games. But even so, we still keep our pulse on everything. And I think what we just want to get across today, and maybe you'll have more thoughts on this, Devin, is just to share some of the new interesting things companies are up to. And we can talk about it a little bit from a game maker's lens. And Devin, you're more the hands-on game maker of the two of us than I am. And so I'm sure you'll have a lot to add. But even just talking about it from a business perspective and from a trends perspective and just calling out some BS perspective, I'm looking forward to doing today too. So let's dive in.
Putting the perspective into perspective here.
That's right.
Cool. Well, I mean, there's a lot going on in AI across the board. Games are definitely being touched by it. And I think some of that is obviously going to happen regardless of whether people, quote unquote, want it or not, because, well, the fundamentals of making games are getting pretty tough these days, to say the least, in this funding environment. So it's kind of essential. But just kind of taking a high level view of where things are now in this super fast, I'd say, river of progress here. Where are we kind of at? What do you think of the sort of the landscape in general?
Yeah, well, obviously we're still in the first inning of AI taking hold in the industry, and we're at a point where it is being used and treated and viewed very differently in different places. And so, as we'll dig into some examples, in mobile, for example, a lot of mobile teams are being very aggressive, hands on across the production pipeline, across the ad creation pipeline, across everything to figure out how to use, not just AI for simple procedural efficiency gains, but actual generative AI to help with asset production. Whereas if you look in the console PC space, that's very much voodoo right now. And if you even have an accidental slip up where in your giant game there's one piece of art on the wall that you forgot to switch over that was generated by AI, you're going to have incessant headlines about your game and how unethical you are, and it's ridiculous. So we could talk more about the ridiculousness of it all. But obviously, those studios, because it's viewed very differently by gamers, have to tread more carefully. And there's also a difference in how people, different parts of the world, view AI. There's a pretty big split between East and West that is very interesting. And so there's all this nuance that I think is worth unpacking. And then, of course, like I think we're still more in the part of the cycle where people are viewing AI more for production efficiency gains, which is super powerful. And at a time, as we talked about, much in the past where AAA budgets are out of whack and unsustainable, AI coming in actually is a pretty big deal and maybe helping right sizing what some of those difficulties have been. But we're not quite at the point of the cycle where there's a ton of new, interesting things where AI is unlocking entirely new kinds of games, novel mechanics. There's some of that, but it's not at the point where it's, truly found a wedge yet and is taking meaningful market share. And I think that is to come, maybe on some platforms more than others. So it's interesting where we are right now, but it feels good to have like innovation in the industry. And even though people are often talking more about the downsides of what we see here, there actually is a lot of upside too, which is exciting.
Yeah, disruptive, I think, is the key word here. Like, it's going to be good and bad, but extremely disruptive to the industry. But at a time when I think many industries are already being disrupted just by the economy, just by the sort of inflation of things, the costs, the budgets being out of control, the sort of scattering of the way people play games, the generational shifts, kind of timing wise, it seems like all this was going to kind of be inevitable anyways in the sense of a big disruption, but this may offer some solutions as well as some potential downsides. And I think that's why we want to discuss today a little bit some of the ways it's actually being used publicly, so that we could talk real details in terms of actual usages as opposed to sort of the theoretical fear mongering or hype, like it could do everything kind of thing. And the nice thing, of course, is the AI is gaining capability every day, it seems, where like I remember maybe just a year ago, you couldn't trust anything it said. Now it's getting to the point where it's like, well, I have to fact check a few things, but otherwise it's pretty good. And then as far as actually doing stuff, I remember we were talking last year about, like, oh, agentic AI is going to be amazing. And like, everyone's like, that's hype. But then it's doing stuff. It's absolutely doing stuff. I mean, not always well, but I mean, we're getting pretty close. And I think games are kind of an interesting space because they're all kind of about smoke and mirrors to an extent, right? It's like this virtual world, everything's kind of fake in some way. And so this idea that like AI is involved, I think just putting it in the right place. So we're going to talk about a bunch of different places it's kind of being used based off of what different companies have said with some actual examples. We may even have some links in the show notes if it's appropriate to some of these articles, just kind of give people something to look at to follow up as well. But just starting off with like the earliest part of game development.
Yeah, well, honestly, even before like getting to that, just like a couple like big picture thoughts to like set the scene. Like I hinted at this, but like I actually do think it's worth talking about a little bit, which is just gamer sentiment towards AI being so anti-AI is ridiculous at this point. And it pains me to see every company bend the knee essentially to what gamers are demanding. And you can go on Reddit and even solo developers are asking questions like, is it ethical for me to use this AI tool in my game development? And to read the comments, it's just like, oh my God, like people actually are like applying morality to just like tools. Like, this is
Yeah.
just technology. It's not inherently good or bad. And we've seen this before too, where I don't know if it's always been this way in the gaming community or when it like hit a tipping point of this mob mentality. But we saw this, with Web3 too, where the whole gaming
Yeah.
community was anti blockchain. And while it's fair to be skeptical of something adding value to the games that you want to play. And of course, like gamers can play whatever they want, but
Yeah.
to like start clinging to reasons like we hate blockchain gaming because it's bad for the environment. It's like it's just like it's uninformed, it's stupid. And I think we're seeing like the echoes of that again. And uh AI now for games. And now, like the mob mentality has, shifted its focus to
Yeah.
this new boogeyman. And I really want to see, like, on one hand, I understand why companies are bending the knee to some degree, because if piss off all of these gamers, like they're not going to buy your games, or they'll speak negatively and you'll get review bombed or whatever it might be. So it's understandable to take this slow approach and like be very methodical to not do anything that upsets the community. But at the same time, the reasons why they're getting upset are just like fundamentally factually wrong. It makes zero sense, and I really want to see the industry figure out how to spin narratives to make it better. And we're starting to see some of this where like we're not going to it's not going to lay off people. It's all about empowering people. And everything is going to be still human created in the end, but we're just going to use it for prototyping. And you see like these like small stepping stones
Right.
towards getting there. But where are the Western companies, especially, that are going to take a stand and change the narrative? And the reason this is important is that you can bend the knee now to save your business. But if you bend the knee and shoot yourself in the foot for not learning how to like truly innovate and take on these next generation capabilities, you're not going to be competitive in the long run. You're not going to be competitive against the companies in other parts of the world that are being way more aggressive than you, working way harder than you to implement and use new technology. And I don't see this ending well, which is why I bring
Yeah.
it up. And so, like, there must be some kind of industry change. Maybe it's about like creating something new and stupid that you can get the mob mentality to go
Right.
obsess over something new and distract them from caring about AI so much. Or maybe it's something else, but it's ridiculous and it needs to end.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you look at game development as a marathon, bending the knee tends to put you pretty far behind. So it's definitely like it's tricky, especially the bigger the company and the bigger the risk and things like that. Which is funny because the bigger companies tend to also like not care as much sometimes. Like they just do what they want to do, but then they have like all the damage control and everything else. And I think ultimately it comes down to usually two things. One is quality, meaning like quote unquote slop. Where I think that gap's being closed pretty quick in
Yeah.
terms of like it's getting to the point where quality can get sometimes better than people, or you have people just kind of touch it up after, make slight changes. And then the other one, of course, is replacing people. And I think the big one on that is art side of things, not so much like coding. I think most people like see the replacement of coding as like, okay, cool, which is funny because like those are the more highly paid people that are then getting put out of work potentially. But that's the one that I feel like gamers are just like, all right, that's fine. Like if an entire like huge AAA game came out, it was coded by AI, unless it was buggy as hell, no one would even accuse it of being AI coded. No one would notice. No one would care. So that one's just under the rug by default. Whereas like it seems like the art side of things is where all the debate really ends up being. And like the quality side of that should be quickly shored up. So then it just becomes down to how do we make sure we're not like at a time when people are being laid off like crazy, just throwing gas on the fire. And I think get past that and it's And we can just move on and do cool stuff and make fun games again. Either that, or like you said, if you want to get people to embrace it, I guess just go like the brain rot direction, right? Where it's just like no one cares about the quality or people being replaced or any of that. Those sort of genres.
Yeah, and a lot of it is up to the platforms too to kind of set the tone. Like obviously, Steam having AI labeled games or not, just adds fuel to the fire unnecessarily of calling things out when it really isn't important to be called out. And yeah, I wish they would change their policies. I don't know if they will, but I mean, we can talk about Roblox later too. But they, like, do gamers on Roblox care at all about AI being in their games? No, like they're so well positioned. And so it really is just this console PC cohort. But yeah, I still think the narrative must be forced to change somehow, or else it's just going to put Western game development in an even harder spot.
Right.
And yeah, you're right that if you bend the knee now, maybe it sets you back for the marathon. But I'm even so, like, it's like you're just like shooting your capabilities long term, and figuring that out seems really important. But anyways, we could dive into the details. Yeah. It's just crazy to me, and I feel like it needs to be talked about more.
Absolutely, and I think it's just kind of like taking a little bit of a realistic stand, but it's one of those things where it's just it's going to have to trend over time, and it's not going to be instant. I mean, unlike the blockchain side of things, I think concrete uses are well spread out and actually like for sure there, and not just like in these cases it's cool and neat and interesting like blockchain was, whereas this is like, no, this is happening now, this has been happening, will happen more, this is kind of inevitable outside of like, of course, technology risks and things like that. But like, I mean, just starting at the very beginning, we have like companies using AI publicly to the point where it's pre-production even, with companies like Capcom talking about using it for ideation, where you have this possibility to use AI to sort of develop ideas, to come up with them, to brainstorm, to try and scattershot things, whether that comes from like just coming up with brainstorming ideas all the way to like, developing prototypes and things like that. We have this ideation sort of pre-production pipeline, which is great, because that's an area where people probably don't spend enough time, partially because it feels like you're burning money because you're not making anything outside of maybe prototypes at that point. But this is an area where like Capcom's admitted, hey, like we're using this to help us come up with better ideas to like, I mean, you can help it, have it do bits of market research, for example, where you're pulling in some data that might help you in the ideation phase, or help kind of try different ideas out where you don't have people to pull into a brainstorming meeting 24/7. You have someone that's available as an AI that could maybe have some of your institutional knowledge in there. So I mean, thoughts on at least what Capcom has said about how they plan to use it in sort of that phase.
Not too many thoughts other than it just seems really obvious to do that. And I can't imagine there honestly are that many high talent teams that aren't using AI in some way right now for idea generation. I'm sure there are some holdouts, but yeah, I mean, it just seems like a very obvious thing to do. Like, it's not really part of like production pipelines, not super embedded into like the actual making of the game. If it's a lot of this pre-work and just kind of giving ideas to discuss with the team and narrow in more what you want to do, it just feels like a very easy, obvious place to start. So yeah, I mean, go Capcom. I feel like it's sort of like the least you can do, honestly, to benefit from AI here. But even so, it's a good place to start.
Yeah, it's funny coming from them, because now they're kind of like starting to rely on their franchises that they've built up. So it's like maybe that's where they need help on figuring out new ideas outside of those franchises.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know if AI will do that for them, where it's just like, hey, ChatGPT, give me more video game ideas to make. But I mean, if it can help them, narrow in on like designs or enemy concepts or whatever, just as a part of brainstorming, sure. Like it can only be helpful.
I know people like get concerned with that, it's derivative ideas, or it's just kind of rehashing stuff that already exists, which to an extent it does, because that's literally what it's doing. But I think that's
entertainment.
That's human creativity in general, to an extent.
We're all standing on everyone's shoulders. That's just the way it works.
I have found in using it myself for that process, when it comes to like just kind of, brainstorming, throwing things at the wall. The one thing I'll say for that like people kind of tend to forget is you are still the director, you're still the editor when it comes to ideas. And I found more often than not, I'll throw away half of what it says, but it inspires other ideas. And I think that's like an underutilized thing is sort of like a sounding board. When you have someone you could just spit out ideas to you to make you think of stuff as you're saying it, or when they say something back, it inspires other ideas. So even if all of it's doing is just being like, that's a great idea, and reaffirming what you said, which can lead to its own bad decisions, but it can really lead to like making you more creative by sort of pulling you out of the corner you're stuck in and your brain. So I would say like it's one of those things where we won't necessarily see its impact on games unless they just become more derivative, I suppose. But they've already gotten to the point where they're very derivative as it is. I don't think that's going to make it more of an echo chamber, but it could potentially lead to some more creative ideas that we won't even know were AI inspired unless people come out and say so. So I think that's just one of those things where it's like, how do we just come up with a ton of ideas in bulk at scale and start to vet them or compare them or group them, categorize them? Like there's definitely some things there. But it is a little bit of like a sort of obvious thing to do, but I think doesn't get talked about all that often. So like you said, good on Capcom discuss. And of course they like also say like, we're going to use it for production efficiency, which is kind of the more vague thing, but we'll see what they end up doing with it. As you said though, like earlier, the other thing we tend to see is like people, when it comes to seeing like things that are in there later from that early phase, placeholder assets have become kind of a big discussion point. So like Crimson Desert just is the latest victim of leaving stuff crazy in. And you always wonder, like, there is that sort of like, did they plan to see if they could get away with it? Or was it like they actually genuinely left? And I think more often than not, it's actually just left in there by accident. And maybe they need AI managing its own, pulling its stuff out so it doesn't forget. But
baby, I don't know why anyone cares. It's crazy to me why we care so much about this. We got to move on. Yeah, we got to move beyond the point of like so many headlines talking about, oh, they accidentally left one tiny AI thing in this enormous game. Is ridiculous.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's the scale of the games, and I think people, it's kind of funny because people want the scale there, but they don't always want to feel like that's mass produced. And I think that's the problem is like they feel like, oh no, now it's some mass produced thing because like somehow there's like this cheap quality, like it's fake on the other side, like a stage set or something. Like, oh no, this thing's not real now because a human didn't make it, which of course, if anyone knows anything about game production, like that early process where it's just gray boxes and stuff anyways, like, yeah, technically a human made that gray box, but it's like, it's a lot easier to get an idea and iterate on the game early on when you can have placeholder assets that aren't just gray boxes or quote unquote programmer art.
Yeah.
So I think, it just speeds up and improves game production.
Definitely.
So yeah, especially since you like often can't, do heavy revisions later in the process. It's very expensive the further you get into production. And so like the earlier you can identify where problems are or get a feel for the game or playtest it, I think all the better. And if people do get distracted when playtesting by bad art and stuff like that. So if you can have high quality AI art in there when you're testing early, I think it's one of those things where I don't think the general public will really kind of understand the benefit of that until they see the games come out, like hopefully with better tuning on the play. But I feel a little bit for Crimson Desert on that, like just because obviously they put a lot of work into that game, and I seriously doubt it's some AI slot fest. But it's like, well, we had to like develop on as fast as we could because the costs just escalate the longer you produce a game because of labor, especially these days. And that also leads into another one who tends to get accused of leaving stuff in and is actually going through the process of replacing it, which is Arc Raiders. They actually have supposedly gone through the process of replacing some of the voice stuff that they've used with they've gone back and re-recorded or actually recorded for the first time some stuff with voice actors. So you have this interesting thing where it's like they're replacing in public something that got backlash, but the backlash wasn't like bad enough to like tank the game or anything, but it was still like they were publicly admitting, yeah, we're using it like this because we're a small company and we need to keep our costs low. And you need to understand that, like, we brought this game to you that's beyond, like, punching above where we should have been able to do. And some of that is due to AI. And like, now that we're making money, we can afford to like replace some of that stuff now. So yeah, it's an interesting take.
Yeah. I read that story and I couldn't tell how much of it was spin on behalf of Embark to just try to make people feel better about what they're doing, or to like backtrack and what their plans actually are. Because part of me, like, I doubt they want to like go and use real voice actors if they can still do a very good job with text to voice and it serve their needs perfectly well. And basically,
Right.
what they were saying, to build off of what you were laying out, was that as a smaller team, they had less budget, right? And so, in terms of the corners that they picked to cut, voice actors was one of them because they could do something good enough with AI. But now that their budget is changing because they've been successful, they're now fully under Nexon, they got all this cash flow flowing. Um, they want to do whatever the best outcome for the game is. And it happens that with this voice chat, the best outcome isn't AI, it still is real people. And that may be true. I don't know how true it really is for them, but that's basically what they're getting across. And so, if it's true, I think that's valiant. It makes sense. Like, ultimately, build the best game. And if you have the resources to do it and it is economically viable and makes sense for you, do it. And if it doesn't, then you got to pick where and how you're going to invest your resources. So again, if it's true, great. I just couldn't honestly tell if like it still felt a little like spin to me that they're at the tip of the spear in terms of these like console PC companies innovating with AI, but are also now sensing more backlash towards AI than when they first started working on it and thinking about it, and so are adjusting to the moment now that they are successful and have less at risk there. But yeah, it's interesting, and even with I guess Nexon more broadly, it's I know that Patrick Soderlund, who was the founder and head of Embark, he was recently pulled in as chairman of Nexon. It'll be interesting to see how a lot of these learnings will kind of trickle through Nexon, and I don't necessarily foresee the AIification of everything taking place, but what we are seeing and what he has laid out is more concentrated bets, and so like really working through the portfolio and just doubling down where it makes the most sense to and cutting back where it doesn't. And not all of that is AI driven, but where they do double down, it will be interesting to see how they do so differently than maybe Nexon did in the past, and to what extent they take on the Embark playbook about just leveraging technology in new and interesting ways, some of which has a lot to do with AI, some of it doesn't. And I think maybe I've said this before, but Nexon will be a really good and important case study in how a large publisher adapts to the world of AI, because they have, a leader in that space that has the real opportunity to help kind of re-steer the culture, especially now that Patrick is chairman of Nexon. And if they can't do it, then that makes me a little worried for everyone else.
Yeah.
But if they can, I think it's a positive signal and hopefully provide some best practices of what a lot of other companies can learn from.
Yeah, I think Nexon broadly and Embark, of course, are definitely worth watching in this, because the approach that they've taken is they were able to succeed at doing the finals and arc raiders to the quality level they were because they completely rethought everything. Like they're not always specific on exactly what that is, right? There's only so many examples given around, like say, for example, photography for textures, things like that, or the AI for the sort of voice call outs where it didn't make economical sense to record those. But like there's just a lot of every aspect of production process they're willing to question, and I think that's exactly the kind of company that brings this stuff forward, where they go, we're not questioning it for shareholder value, we're not questioning it for just budget, we're questioning it for, does this make sense for modern game development to do this process that is something sort of that brings, and these are all veteran game developers. This is not like a company of new people coming in like some Silicon Valley startup that's like, oh, let's just YC Combinate disrupt this sort of thing. It's more like, or do we have to do it the way we kept doing it because we see the writing on the wall that is not going to work anymore at the budgets we're talking about? and we still want to keep up that quality level. It's not about shortcutting quality. It's about like, does this production process still make sense now that we have new technology? It's like, we talk about like all these modern game engines and all the cool stuff you could do now that you used to have to do by hand. And it's like, well, that's something to leverage, right? And they're looking at all these things. What else is out there that we leverage? And AI is clearly something that can be leveraged. And I think it's interesting to see some of the approaches they're trying to take, where it's not just stuff that might be public facing, like the AI voice stuff, but also like internal processes. So they didn't really like get into super detail in this, but it was interesting. He was talking about like almost basically taking all their data and sort of compiling it into this Mono Lake thing of like best practices. It wasn't like super clear on exactly how that would work, but it sounded like they were almost taking like what are all the things that we've learned and put it in almost in this like expert system on like these best practices, especially I think around the live ops stuff, which was interesting because Arc Raiders was benefiting from Embark didn't have the live service experience as much. They learned a bit on the finals, but they were actually relying quite a bit from what he'd said on Nexon's help on their live service experience to help teach them a bit as well, whereas they teach Nexon then some of the things they learned from their production process. And now they're trying to combine that into this sort of like, genius AI that is an internal system that they can tap sort of to spread best practices across the company, which is a really interesting idea of like, can we now have this expert that is available? Like, imagine you're working in this company and you could pull this guy into any meeting you want and he'll help be like, oh, I've been working here forever. I know everything about games, but I actually have it from real data, not just my opinion. And I'll help guide your game for you. It was almost like this mentor for every possible game. Which, and again, I'm going off of what he said, which is a bit vague, but it's a really interesting idea of sort of this internal thing that's not something public facing, not going to make someone mad in the public, but is clearly looking to upgrade quality without it being like a production pipeline thing necessarily. And I think that's some really innovative approaches to AI use that I don't think we're seeing as much. And that goes kind of to that sort of ideation thing Capcom was talking about. Let's say that's also involved in that process. Like, hey, how should we approach coming up with new games? What is the best ways to do that? These sorts of things will be really interesting to see when there's these sort of data moats, because he was talking about that as a bit of a moat for Nexon as well. Like if they're basing it off of real world data. Now, keep in mind, of course, real world data does change, right? So like trends change over time. You can't just go like, well, this worked 10 years ago, I'm going to do it now. But at the same time, like they can correct that, right? They can be like, hey, that's not current anymore, AI. You need to update your stuff. But it's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, this Mono Lake thing, I agree, is pretty interesting. Just to read a quote, and this is from gamedeveloper.com. It says, Mono Lake is built as an end-to-end intelligence platform capable of weighing in on every single production decision. Nexon said the technology has been trained on billions of player sessions and decades of live game data, including engagement patterns, retention and monetization habits, and live telemetry. So it's not a generative AI tool, right? Like it's a black box to understand from the outside, but it makes so much sense to build these internal models based on companies' own data. Because for any of us that use any of these public-facing LLMs, they have so many blind spots when it comes to gaming, right? Like they can't play the games, they don't see the games. You're not, and especially like they're not always up to date on what is going on right now. They can try to stitch it together from articles from the past, but they're just blind to so much of what is going on. But being able to reduce the blindness internally with your own tools makes a lot of sense, and is the kind of thing that these larger companies should have pretty strong competitive advantages for. Obviously, how it's executed and made truly helpful, there's a pretty big like last mile gap there that I think is fair to question and may take some time to like truly be helpful across several domains of game creation. But even so, it does seem like a worthy tool to try to figure out how to make that just puts your own company's context inside of a model to kind of reduce that blindness factor. So I'm really curious to see, I mean, for Nexon itself, but also just how some of these other companies will go about similar types of tools to solve that blindness problem specifically.
Yeah. And I think Embark did prove a little bit that they could do sort of these innovative things with AI and machine learning based off of what they did for the AI itself in the game in terms of training it through machine learning. I think that's a good proof that they like can actually potentially walk the walk or have their robots walk the walk. In the case
Yeah.
of that, but like what they do with there was not just like, oh, this is theoretical and it'd be cool, but then it turned out some buggy mess when the game comes out. It's actually a really interesting thing that actually works. And so, like, obviously, we probably won't see like this sort of thing publicly, like how it works, unless it's like a GDC talk or something showing how it works. But it's still, these sorts of internal things I think are something that are going to continue to happen, and you'll kind of find out about them in bits and pieces. But as far as like the public stuff, we have some other interesting ones that are like more public facing for players. That are interesting, and it's obviously one big one that I think a lot of people are excited about potentially shifting the industry a bit, but obviously being maybe a little early is like AI for characters in games is a big one. Obviously, and that's an expensive thing to do unless you have like a lot of local processing. But like Krafton, for example, is trying to push big into experimenting in that area with like co-playable characters, not just like NPCs, but actually like characters that play along with you. We have like a lot of ones trying to train off of like actual player data so they could play alongside you. And we see that a lot. They're talking about that with PUBG, having like teammates that are actually act like people as opposed to really dumb bots.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. And also note, we've talked about Capcom and Nexon and Krafton. These are all the Asian companies. We haven't even talked about the Chinese companies yet, which are probably like the most aggressive. But who have we not talked about? Pretty much like any leading Western company so far. Yeah. Where are you? Stop bending the knee to the mob.
We'll get into some European ones at best here.
Yeah, I guess. And mobile's a little different, which I think is where a lot of the European action has been. But absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Krafton is cool. I mean, they've hired like a chief AI officer, which I guess we'll see like how that kind of role finds its way into the games industry or what that really will look like in time. And to Krafton's credit too, I mean, it's still a founder-run business, and I think you're going to see more founder-led businesses be the ones that are still in building mode, still, have like a chip on their shoulder or like don't want to, they're not just managing the business. They're looking to like create iconic companies, right? And Krafton is still of that mold. And when it comes to their AI efforts, they basically have outlined three main strategies. One is to elevate gameplay, like the better NPCs and more reactive environments like you were talking about. The second is supporting development teams, and these are the AI tools that help streamline repetitive or technical tasks. Pretty obvious stuff that makes sense. But the third one, where it gets kind of funky, is the exploring long-term research opportunities. And they're basically talking about how they are doing research into physical AI and robotics through a new entity they established called Ludo Robotics. And they're operating out of Korea and the US. And it sounds like a World Models type of company, similar to General Intuition or other companies in that space, where they're leveraging the data that you get from games to inform, like how robotics makes decisions in these in these like fluid worlds where actions lead to cause and effect outcomes you have to predict and understand and be able to work with. And I honestly, I don't know what to make of it from like a crafting point of view. Like, can they be competitive here? Does it make sense? Like on one hand, I kind of get it because Korea, I don't know if you saw this, but there was a report that came out that was showing that Korea has adopted robotics in the workplace more than every other country in the world. For every 10,000 employees, there are 1,012 robots working in Korea. And if you think about it, it makes sense because they're facing population decline and to which will only accelerate, and to, they need more workers, and to get more work done, they will need robotics. And maybe they can still grow the economy and such with fewer people and more robots. And so I don't know to what extent what Krafton is doing feeds into that, but in general, like it's interesting how you can still leverage data for video games as an input, even if the output is for something else. And with Krafton also more generally, we've seen signs that they care to expand beyond just gaming. This is still ultimately a PUBG driven business. And of course they've like moved into publishing and, are looking to publish all sorts of games. They've been prolific investors across the games industry in recent years, but their latest big acquisition was of I think it was called ADK, which is a big Japanese ad agency and anime producer, which at the time signaled that Krafton wants to become a bigger, broader entertainment company. But now with these like doubling down on investments in AI, it just shows that they're just trying to leverage what they have into these like concentric circle domains. And maybe some will be more successful than others. It wouldn't surprise me. Like when you take these shots and you pioneer, not everything will work out. But I like seeing the spirit that Krafton has and just trying to innovate and embracing it and pushing it forward. And they will do interesting things, even if it doesn't all work out. And will be like an interesting company in the process versus just, taking a back seat and just watching everyone else do it and hope to not get disrupted too hard in the process. So yeah, I mean, just in general, I kind of like what they're doing. I don't know what to make of it all, but the mindset looks to be on track.
Yeah, and I mean, hopefully, like enough of the learnings become public. Obviously, we often have to rely on postmortems and things of things that failed or just barely succeeded. A lot of times, it tends to be the topic of postmortems because those are the more interesting ones to read. But if we get to these, they're sort of if they're taking so many shots that sort of filters out to others to learn from, just because it's expensive bets to make. Obviously, we're in a situation where you kind of have to make some expensive bets or you fall behind. Mm-hmm. So it's nice when the sort of thing spreads across so that like as an industry, we can evolve faster and not stumble as much. Because I think as much as people love, they're doom scrolling and watching videos and stuff on people failing, it would be a little bit better for this industry if we could fail upward a little faster and not so much stumble around like we kind of are right now as an industry. And so like, hey, if Krafton's going to be part of that, cool. Like they've obviously taken that PUBG success and are leveraging it in lots of different ways. And it sounds like pretty broad ways beyond just the game itself or just like expanding that brand. They did actually like seem to tighten things up a little bit recently too, that they shut down that PUBG blind spot that they were doing, that the sort of like overhead tactical shooting game. So I guess they backed off away from that one. So like, hopefully we get a postmortem on that and other ones where we're like, okay, what are they learning? As you said, the Asian developers tend to be the ones taking all these shots and being really interested in that. And the economic side of replacing the workers from the physical standpoint is a really interesting point. Like I've heard of Japan doing the same thing where they're like starting to be more embracing of foreigners, for example, just to help replace workers in different areas. And then of course, like then we're talking about, oh no, AI is going to come take jobs. But it sounds like maybe it's more like if those jobs are just sitting there waiting, maybe we're just like, well, maybe we need those to fill gaps. And maybe the narrative sort of flips around where it's like, let's say we didn't have a lot of experienced people to be able to scale up in different, and maybe other territories become, where we're talking about Westerns developers, like maybe we're behind because we're like, oh, we have a zillion artists, we don't need AI to help us there. And so like we're maybe, a little stubborn there, but other areas might be like, we don't have enough talented artists here. We could use that stuff. Like, I think of like India, right? Where they might have a lot of people, but they need to build up some level of experience and things like that in certain places. They can benefit from also mastering AI to help scale up their workforce. So stuff like that. It's really interesting to see where these bigger companies are spending that money.
Yeah, we get caught in our own echo chambers all the time of like groups and the headlines saying like what we should be doing because it's the right thing to do. And it turns out if you zoom out and look in different places around the world, it's just different realities. And what you think is the morally right thing to do for, your group is just not even realistic for others. And so, AI, I think is and robotics, probably just like one more domino on a long chain of dominoes that, it's good to be humble and to not get caught up in your own beliefs too hardcore all the time.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of, replacing people or like, shoring up labor issues, there's an interesting one looking at the mobile side, which is definitely going to embrace like AI a lot more. And I've said this a few times that it's just like people don't care as much there. The gamers don't care. The game developers are also a lot more numbers focused, I suppose, despite, still wanting to be creative and make cool things. The subject being games, they were going to have to sunset Sunrise Village And instead of doing so, they actually found that from the live ops perspective, they could actually implement a lot of AI while still having quality control, while still having editorial control, and ways to improve it, so that they could keep the game going with basically a skeleton crew. They went, I think, from was like with like 25 to 2 people or something crazy like that, where they scaled way back in terms of the number of people required to keep that game going. And it wasn't so they could fire people, so they could work on other games. The way Embark's like, hey, we're using this to help us also work on many different games, take more shots, things like that. Something that's very difficult to do, especially when it comes to like how expensive it is to develop a game prior to getting any revenue. Right? It's not like the movies these days where they make them in 6 months. And then just shoot them out in the next 6. Games take years to make, and so you're in this situation where it's like, well, we've got to keep this game going, and we've got to make new games, and we're not going to be making revenue from this new game for years, and we've got to spend money to keep this other game going, and hopefully make some money off that. So I think it's a really interesting, very public perspective of how to do it, where it wasn't just like, oh, let's just ask AI to do it real quick. They had to build out a whole pipeline and stuff, but it's really interesting that it's like full on generating sort of some of the thematic ideas, generating the art, and then that can be touched up by the artist, generating the levels, populating the levels. I think even potentially doing some of the QA on the content. All the stuff that they were normally doing, they're having AI at least do maybe 75 to 80% of, and then they're finishing it up or making sure that it's doing it correctly. And of course, I'm sure tuning the pipeline as they do that. But having built that out now, suddenly now this game is around for players to play, as long as they can keep that running. And it sounds like that's economically feasible as long as it's making money. I mean, how many games have been shut down because there was less than the economically viable number of players, yet there was still tons of people that's like, why can't this stay around? And it makes me think of like, is it really interesting to think about like, say, MMOs that all get shut down, but then all have like emulated versions now where it's like fan run. And it's like, well, obviously it wasn't the server costs if people are able to sort of keep those around and keep playing those sort of emulated. Maybe there's a possibility for games to be preserved even longer. Well, not just the live ops side, but just even keeping a game running on the server side and stuff. So it's really interesting to see that the mobile being willing to, and they're not being shy about it. It's like, hey, we're keeping the game going. We're still in charge of all of it. We're still touching all of it. It's not like completely hands off. We're just looking the other way, but we're able to keep content coming for you as a player without having to spend all of our money on doing so. And that means just longer play for players.
Yeah, I don't have too much more to add about InnoGames specifically, but technology becomes most interesting when it changes the underlying economics and just makes new types of behaviors possible. And you're basically outlining how that's working on the kind of the tail end of the game life cycle here. But I mean, it seems like, especially with mobile, it's just going to affect every stage of the life cycle pretty intensely, both from prototyping to launching. Like we've even seen on recently, we're going to write about this in Naavik Digest soon, but there's been basically a spike in the number of apps published on app stores, but also like games published on app stores, like over the past few months, because of tools like Replit and such. And we've starting to see stories about like, all right, this person literally prototyped like 1,000 games and published all of them, and he's gonna double down on the 2 that show like the most like natural organic retention, like the best retention and traction and such. And yeah, it makes a lot of sense on the earliest stages to the middle stages of if you are on this live ops treadmill and it becomes super expensive to maintain for a lot of teams, especially for bigger games or for teams that are located in certain parts of the world. Like, yeah, this is going to change the way you work. It's going to change dramatically how advertising and user acquisition works, with testing all sorts of different prototypes and pushing things forward and learning about, like more intelligently of like why certain ads may be performing better than others and continuing to iterate. Yeah, just like literally every part of the mobile stack of game making, I think, is going to be tested. Even on like game engines too, which people don't question too much. Like we're starting to see like companies like Bezi, I think it's pronounced, come along, which are building more like Unity supported like development capabilities, because Unity and Unreal, they're not very AI native for game development and pose a lot of issues that it's just going to take time to unwind to help accelerate game development in a true AI native way. And yeah, seeing more tools, more ways of working. Yeah, it's happening. This isn't even a future a future prediction. This is just literally what's happening right now. And I'm sure we can get more people on the podcast to talk into the specifics of like what they're actually doing and what they're seeing, which would be super interesting. But yeah, it's just even from a distance, it's like very clear that everything is changing very fast here.
Yeah, and it's definitely something where once we start seeing it at the engine level too, that just will like proliferate it across so many different games that weren't necessarily even exploring AI yet. And it's one of those things where it's like that's leverage across the whole game industry as opposed to just individual games. And I think that's something we'll see obviously over time here is productizing some of this, where it's like there are a lot of startups coming out of it and stuff like that. Whereas right now it's very roll your own for what you're doing. What are your internal processes? How can you implement this in different ways? Everyone kind of figuring it out. But as people figure it out, you might even see game companies spin off their own thing. So like everyone loves to talk about how Unity was originally making a game and then they decided to make an engine instead. And I think we'll see that sort of same thing where some of these people developing some of these internal tools may eventually go, you know what, like I'm going to go spin off a company from that like internal tool into a product that now everyone can use. And I think we've seen that a lot in the game industry where a lot of products were developed first for a game and then they're like, hey, what we're doing is great. I mean, Unreal Engine as well. Like, I mean, that's literally from the game Unreal where they were developing that. And so I think that sort of thing where right now it's very, patchwork, sort of what can we do? As people figure that out, that starts to spread because it becomes a product. Then that starts to spread around to different games. And then it's suddenly like everywhere all at once. And I don't think that's that far off, but I think that's when we start to see it really take off. Obviously, like there is like the issue though, of course, of the more you rely on other people's technology. And that is one concern I have with some of this stuff is a lot of it's relying on these cloud services and other sort of things where they're burning money right now. But that being said, I think the concern about that sometimes is a little bit hedged by how often the open source models are usable and other things where it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be usable in production. And I think you start to see more of these things where it's like, hey, like I'm just going to run my own open source, like little server here inside the company. And now I don't have to rely on those external tools, stuff like that. So I think we're already hedging bets on this stuff, which is great because like the future like is getting pre-paved a bit, I think, with a lot of this stuff. Even though it's hard grunt work right now where they're in there pulling out weeds and paving dirt trails, like those are getting like turned into streets faster than I think we would anticipate with a lot of other game industries. Because like you said, people are straight up just able to shotgun out games now at this point. And obviously like that the quality is going to be hit and miss with that. But like way more shots on goal to the point where it's going to get pretty overwhelming. And now we're going to have to flip to using AI for discovery just to sift through this stuff. So AI is going to have to help solve some of the problems it's creating.
Yeah.
Ultimately. Speaking of which, though, like I think another interesting area that we've talked about here on the podcast a couple times before as well, but we see like companies like King using it is on the QA side. Not just QA in terms of looking for bugs, but QA in terms of like game quality. So like they have it for Candy Crush Saga where they're actually having it test levels and not just test it for bugs. They're testing it for like difficulty, moves that people can do, like overall balance. It's really interesting to see like QA beyond just bugs, but actual quality assurance. And I think that's an area that's like maybe underutilized. And then something that we're going to see, I think a little bit more is, humans can only test so much and we want to keep these games in such a big scale like we were talking about earlier. How do you make sure that works into all these tons of iterations, not to mention also testing in tons of hardware configurations? We have so many problems with PC optimization, for example, that now potentially AI could be a help in that. I think there's a lot of opportunity here to sort of help fix one of game industry's biggest problems right now, which is a lot of games coming out half-baked. And maybe AI could speed up that sort of baking, like the microwave oven here for sort of baking the last bit.
Yeah. We've talked about QA benefiting from AI in this podcast a few times before, through interviews and such too. And even one of our partners, Model AI, is doing like super interesting stuff here. Some teams will build their own capabilities like King and Candy Crush. What they need is very specific to them. But for other companies that maybe are smaller, are working on more diverse kinds of games, working with a model AI type of business, makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it seems that there will just be like pretty obvious efficiency unlocks here. One
Yeah.
of many domains that will see those kinds of unlocks, but is a pretty clear one.
Yeah, and as we talked about, like when I talked to Model AI as well, like it's one of those things where you're like worried, oh, is this going to replace QA people? It's like there's not enough QA people.
Yeah, more
It's one
QA
of those
needs
things.
to be done. Yeah.
We need help. Like it's clearly like replacing people isn't the problem in that space right now. I think it's more just can we get the coverage that we need, and it's more like helping the QA people at that point. So, I mean, I'm excited about that because as unglamorous as it is, games coming out more polished, I think is really important at this time because they're not, and it's a big problem because it's really expensive to do that last 20% polish, and the longer you spend in that, it's like it's dragging game budgets through the mud and then making these releases premature because they have to start getting revenue. As I said, that it takes so long. If we can speed up a quality release, I think that will help. And there's a bunch of areas as well that we haven't really gone into as much that are ones that are not tons of public examples, but are definitely happening. So like I know for sure a lot of people are using like AI for rapid prototyping, where it's like I mentioned earlier, really being able to actually test stuff out earlier and not just like pre-production on the game, but actually on a live ops game. There's companies I've talked to that are straight up using it like, hey, let's try a new mode. And like they could just throw it together in a weekend or like a quick hackathon day, like a lunch break practically sometimes to just try a mode out when you've got like the level of integration where you can actually try stuff. It's amazing what you can do when it's not like I've got to spend 3 weeks talking in meetings and writing up documents about this. Instead, I'll just spend a lunch break trying it out. And it just reminds me of like some of the older days of game development when it was just a few people and they were just hacking away at the game and they would just try cool stuff out. And I think getting back to that phase where we're not like constantly looking at spreadsheet budgets and can just go, what would be cool and fun and just try it. I think that's one of those things where like you're not always gonna see it talked about, but it absolutely I think will impact the fun level of games. In a very positive way. And it's, not just for like indies, but even like big companies where it's hard to move things in there without proving it first. I think the ability to prove it before you plan it rather than plan it for 6 months and then try and prove it, I think will be a huge sort of flip on that script, especially when it's like the coding stuff was a lot of times the hang up, not really the art. And so now the coding side is what's being solved the fastest anyways. So I think that'll be really cool. Like, especially when, we talk about the engines where, they're trying to integrate potentially AI stuff into the engines. I'm looking forward to the day when like the AI has the knowledge about all the different ways to build an engine and it just builds you a custom engine based off of like, hey, like here's all the pieces, all the parts of what would go in an engine. Here's what I might need my game to do. Grab all those pieces, stick them together, make a nice engine. And now you have customized engines for every game as opposed to having to take an off the shelf one. It could be really interesting to see that sort of prototyping level where ideas to execution actually expands out the things that we make instead of just how can I make what I'm already making faster.
Yeah, I'm curious if it will come to that. Part of me thinks that these engine companies will adapt and become, just create much more compelling AI workflows in time, and with add-ons and such to help assist that flow. But yeah, I think you're not wrong. We already kind of see that with vibe coding right now, where you can vibe code a game. It doesn't use Unity. It'll just stitch together some type of JS framework to get done what needs to get done. That's like a very miniature version of creating your own engine, but building more complex versions of something like that is interesting to think about for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely impacting open source engines, I've noticed. So like
Yeah,
Godot is actually, it's benefited a lot from the fact that it's fully open source to have the AI be able to actually comprehend, in theory, the engine and actually be able to make modifications and things like that. And other ones like Cocos and stuff like that. These other engines, I think, could benefit. And maybe that's a moment where Unity and Unreal get a bit more competition from the leveraging of that. But at the same time, I could see like if Epic's able to say, put an AI in place to where now you can create blueprints very easily. So then game designers and other people that generally work at the blueprint level have access to whatever they need, to where it's like, okay, the engine people doing the engine stuff, but then that gets exposed to blueprints very easily and quickly because of AI. Now there's all of a sudden this like accessibility for other people within the company to be able to do things with the game that don't require looping in the programmers all the time, so that they can focus on like the optimizations, the putting in the technology that they need and things like that. That would be really interesting. And on the other side as well, something that I always like to talk about, because I don't hear it talked about a lot, but I think is really cool on the roll your own side, is tooling. One of those areas where like game development benefits a lot from building customized tools inside, where like, hey, this is something we have to do all the time. It's laborious to do, but it's part of our game, and no one else is necessarily doing it, so they don't have a tool for it. It's off the shelf. But if I can spend 10 minutes asking Claude to whip together a custom tool that will do this for me. Like the most common example is like a level editor, right? Like, especially back in the day where you're like, I need a level editor. Here's how my data is structured for the game because of the way I've coded it. I just need a level editor. And you have to spend maybe weeks building a level editor. Well, now you can spend, an hour building it because you can give it the exact specs that you want and the sort of user interface that you want. And now you have a level editor. And I think those kinds of things will speed up production a ton by, again, enabling people that don't always have the access they need or the ability to do it within a time crunch to be able to suddenly do things within the game development. And I don't mean go fully rogue, but I just mean like this idea that you're empowering so many people within the company to be able to do so many things and like take ownership of different parts of the game without having it be this super complicated orchestration of things. Like imagine you're making a movie and you have all the people that have to build the sets and the props and all that stuff. But imagine you still have those people, but you also have these 3D printers accessible where I could go like, hey, I need a prop real quick. Like Fallout show was a good example of that, where they did a lot of 3D printing, right, for props. So they could go, hey, I'll take the 3D models from the game. I just need a prop for that real quick. You're not necessarily cutting out all the people to build all the sets and do all the like set design and production design, but you're making it so now people that aren't in that department can suddenly output pieces that are then useful, or at least can be used for blocking and testing or whatever. And so I think that's a huge lift that won't be glamorous, and it will be kind of company to company, but it's absolutely already happening for sure. So I wanted to ask, like, from the business level, what companies do you think are best positioned to benefit from AI in games?
I think Roblox is number one. We talk about Roblox a lot across the podcast, but just to give an analogous example, outside of gaming, Spotify and music is very well positioned in an AI-driven world because before AI, it was already the platform that helped people navigate more music than they would ever listen to in their lives. And so when AI comes and changes the creation side and, it'll bombard Spotify with more AI created music, Spotify is there to just do what it always did. And it can even leverage AI tools internally to help people better navigate for themselves what they would be interested in. And it operates in a business model that is already fit to this era, which is subscription or freemium. And so I think a lot of those parallels apply to Roblox, where before AI, Roblox was already the place where gamers of a generation will figure out, what they're interested in playing, and they're never going to be able to play everything. They can't. And so when AI comes into the fold, it's just going to be a continuation of what already exists. But more games are going to get made, better games are going to get made, and discovery is going to get even better. And that's only going to turbocharge the network effects that already exist and have already been doing extremely well. And so I kind of view this as, it's just pouring gas on the fire of like a company that's already doing extremely well, but is on track to become a titan of industry. And Roblox is already investing super heavily in its own models to make world creation much easier, etc. And yeah, it too has a business model that just fits perfectly, where like this open, free to play platform with additional transactions added in is going to just fit like what's going to work in an AI world very well. And so, we can talk about all these other types of games and all these other platforms, but at the end of the day, Roblox, still small in the big scheme of things, I think is, to me, is the most obvious winner. And I would give an honorary mention to someone like Tencent, where I think it's hard to understate the value that comes from being uh, like a gaming business inside a bigger tech company, in the sense that if that tech company is like driven in large part by games, like it's going to be innovating in a way that is beneficial to game creation. And so, we talked about all these examples of these teams building their own models, building their own internal tooling and such. A business like Tencent should be able to do that the best out of basically everyone. And it operates in a culture that is fully embracing AI. And, there isn't any like societal worries of the same sense to
Right.
to concern themselves with. And so yeah, I'd be very curious to kind of learn more about what they're doing. But even just from what I've seen more surface level, it is super interesting. And it seems like the kind of thing where the advantages can compound over time. So yeah, I mean, those are kind of the two, but of course, there'll be a whole bunch of startups as well that just build new, cool, interesting things. And even though it might not be like a company that's the biggest winner, it's still just the democratization of game making is a winner, and solo devs and small teams are going to be massive winners of this wave.
Well, on that topic, then, what do you think of the secondary ripple effects that we should expect from these changes?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the bar for funding games is going to continue to rise because if less capital is needed to get started, because people can, just more easily, I don't want to say vibe code, but, like just be way more efficient in prototyping, then investors will increasingly want to see evidence of progress and traction. And we've in the past talked about how the investment landscape is already dramatically changing with VC shrinking down, seeing more project financing, seeing more UA financing, etc. But this is yet another catalyst for change that may also require new types of investors. Like maybe it's not traditional VCs that are best positioned here. It might not even be traditional publishers. It may need to be a different kind of capital providing entity that's involved in different ways at different stages. And I think that's very interesting to see how that will go. But money is less of an issue, than maybe it was in the past, and especially compared to 5 years ago, where most anybody, especially if you're a big name, could get giant checks. Uh, it's not needed, in the same way anymore, just because the way of working has changed. Another thing I would say is that, like for years, the games industry was the tip of the spear of technological innovation. And you would often see like what happens in the games industry first is what will trickle out to the rest of the industry, whether it's like people being together online or what virtual like interactive entertainment online looks like, or what have you. That's not the case anymore, especially in the West. Like the games industry is no longer pioneering technology for the world. And I think that's a big change. And instead, it's the big tech companies. It is like this new wave of AI giants that are like pushing this like broader innovation, and their progress will impact our industry's direction more so than it did in the past, in my opinion. And of course, there always was big technology companies playing a role, like with Microsoft creating an Xbox, for example, or Apple, paving the way for what app stores are. And so that's not to like discount the effect that these companies have had in the past, but for where the like true progress is made in what is possible online and interactive entertainment, I think it's just going to come from different places. And because it comes from different places, I think the way it's going to play out will be a little different from the past, where maybe those companies aren't going to be making games because that requires taste and capability that's fundamentally different. But even so, like, is it going to lead to new types of distribution or new types of discovery, or just like new ways to create that are different than what we've seen? I would guess so. And that's exciting, but it's also probably just going to lead to a lot of change that I feel like is under discussed in the games industry, because the games industry tends to look inwardly on itself instead of looking outwardly on everything else going on. And so I think that probably needs to change in the years to come.
Well, you touched on it earlier, and I think it's worth mentioning is how much game development actually pushes other industries. And like we wouldn't have AI where it is now without games, because what do you think the GPUs were made for that are just snapped up like crazy? NVIDIA is where it is because of gamers, not because of AI, but they're certainly going to leverage it for both. So it's really interesting to see that, how that game industry has sort of pushed tech, has pushed entertainment, has pushed all these things. Obviously, some areas are falling a bit behind and might have to play some catch up, but there's this very symbiotic relationship between tech and innovation and games, maybe just because it's a voluntary pastime that really is important to people, and one of the newer industries compared to a lot of the other ones. So it's really interesting to see.
And it's not to say that innovation won't happen at all. Like we talked about world models, and like the games being a source of data to fuel robotics is super interesting, and probably like very important. But yeah, I have a feeling the innovations will be largely flowing the other way in the next few years, and we need to plan accordingly.
Cool. Well, I'm sure there's lots more that potentially cover here. We'll link some of the stuff. There's a lot happening. And I think we'll hopefully be capturing some of that in that future AI newsletter with details forthcoming there. But definitely some place to look there to keep on top of these things, because, my God, it is very difficult to keep on top. I'm not joking when I read like 6 newsletters a day on this stuff, because it's just so much to stay on top of. So definitely look forward to that. But thanks for stopping by today, Aaron. A lot of cool stuff happening. A lot of the business side of things, I think, also needing to be discussed from a nice realistic perspective, I think, as opposed to hyper doom. So appreciate that perspective. Thanks everyone for sticking around. Hopefully you enjoyed some of the discussion here. Make sure to check out some of the stuff going on in the future newsletter. If you're not already subscribed, make sure you're in the digest and catching the podcasts.
One last thing I want to say before we wrap up is that if you have any questions or thinking through how to better apply AI to your company, come talk to us, and maybe we can help in some ways. And maybe we won't lead to the transformation of your business, but at Naavik, we just naturally know a lot of the companies that are building tools and building like new interesting capabilities. And so if you're looking for specific jobs to be done for your business, let us know, and we can probably provide you a referral that should lead to good outcomes. So if there's any way that we can be helpful here, just send us a note, find us on LinkedIn or on our website, and we'd be happy to help.
Absolutely. I mean, you can always, at the very least, ask if you're not sure, and chances are the answer will be, yeah, we could definitely help with that.
And
just based off of,
we can point you in the right direction.
Exactly. That's what I mean. It's been a very varied and super helpful business to a lot of people. So definitely take advantage of that. But yeah, cool. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
If you enjoyed today's episode, whether on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, or give a 5-star review. And if you want to reach out or provide feedback, shoot us a note at podcast@naavik.co or find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Plus, if you want to learn more about what Naavik has to offer, make sure to check out our website, www.naavik.co. There, you can sign up for the #1 games industry newsletter, Naavik Digest, or contact us to learn about our wide-ranging consulting and advisory services. Again, that is www.naavik.co. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.